This DDI CADcast covers SOLIDWORKS Enterprise PDM, backup, and maintenance. Let's go ahead and get started and take a look at a scenario that we're going to use for this CADcast. First, we have an enterprise vault called development. We're going to cover creating backups of the enterprise database as well as the archive server files. Additionally, we're going to cover some SQL statements and enterprise settings to minimize the size of our backup. The technical resources for this are the Enterprise PDM Admin Guide, the Install Guide, the SOLIDWORKS knowledge base found in the customer portal, and the online help for Microsoft SQL. Let's take a look at the system architecture of a typical enterprise install. The first element is the SQL Server and also the SOLIDWORKS Enterprise Database Server. This is what the clients connect to browse for files, view data cards, and search for files. The second element, which may or may not be on the same server, is the SOLIDWORKS Enterprise PDM Archive Server. This is what clients connect to retrieve physical files with functions like get and check out. Another element that is an optional setting is cold storage. This is a way to kind of a schedule a means of deleting old file versions, and is useful in a large implementation with lots of activity and check in and check out of files. And finally are the local workstations, which hold the local file vault views. This is also referred to as a local cache folder. So let's take a look at which one of these system components are going to be candidates for our backup scheme. The first element is the SQL Server itself. This is done through the SQL Management Studio. Let's go switch over to that application and take a look at a couple of different ways that we can create a backup scheme. So whenever we log in to a server, first we log into the database engine, and then we select the server that we want to connect to along with our credentials. Logging in, if we expand the databases section, we're going to find a couple of databases of interest. First is the Kinesio MasterDB. This houses all the different connection information to the vaults on the server. Second is the actual vault itself, which holds our information for our enterprise vault. So to create a manual backup, first we select the database, right-click, select Tasks, and then go down to Backup. So this is going to create a manual backup. First thing we want to do is select our database, and then we want our backup type to always be full. With Enterprise PDM, you never want to do a differential backup. Finally, we select the backup set name. We can accept the default name or give it a unique name. And then we go down to the backup to, we want to select a particular location or take note of the default location so we can include that in our backup folder. Rather than back up each individual database repeatedly, we can use a maintenance schedule. So if we select Management, go down to Maintenance Plans, right-click, select Maintenance Plan Wizard, we can create a plan that will automate a lot of the redundant tasks that we use for backup. Go ahead and select Next, and then give the maintenance plan a particular name. Notice the two settings: we can set a separate schedule for each task, or we can create a single schedule for the entire plan. So let's go ahead and use a single schedule, and then we'll select Change, give it a name, and then we'll go ahead and run a daily backup. In this particular example, we're going to do this every day at midnight. Go ahead and select OK. Then we'll go ahead and select the elements that we want to include in our maintenance plan. The first component is to back up the actual database. The second component is to back up the transaction log. Now the transaction log contains all the different information as a user checks in, checks out files, adds information to the tables. If we don't back this up, this can grow to be out of proportion. Backing it up will shrink it and keep it at a manageable size, as well as give you a backdoor for in case of a catastrophic failure. Next, we'll want to rebuild the index to help with search functionality to make it run quicker, and then we also want to shrink the database to make the database smaller and more efficient. So once we selected the tasks that we want to include, go ahead and select Next. Next, we want to sequence the order in which all these tasks get completed. So the first thing we want to do is back up the database as it sits. Next, we want to back up the transaction log. Then we'll want to shrink the database. We don't want to shrink the database before we back it up, because sometimes errors can occur, and you want to make sure you have a good backup before you shrink it. And then finally, we'll rebuild the index, because shrinking the database can fragment the database because the way the pages get organized. Next, we want to select what databases to back up. So in this step, we want to back up both the Kinesio master database and the development database. Because we're doing two, we'll go ahead and create a subdirectory for each database and then give it a particular location, or at least take note of the default location, and then select next. For the transaction log, we just need to include the enterprise PDM database itself. Because the Kinesio master database really only sees activity during creating vaults or installation, we don't need to include that in our daily backup. Again, we'll go ahead and add a subdirectory for the transaction log and then select next. The next task is going to be shrinking the database. Again, because the development or the enterprise PDM database we're working on sees the most traffic, we'll go ahead and just select that as a database to shrink. We're going to return the free space to the operating system because the database for enterprise is not predefined, and generally it's not a good idea to do that. For the index, again, we're going to select the enterprise database for development. We don't need to include the Kinesio master DB with this one. So after all of our tasks have been defined, we can write a report or have the maintenance plan create a report. So we'll go ahead and put that out at the root location of where our backups are going to be stored. Finally, the wizard gives us a chance to look at all the tasks and all the different settings. If we need to change something, you can select the back button, go back and make the change. Otherwise, if you're happy with the results, just select finish. It'll run through, validate the plan, tell you everything's successful, then you can close. So that is the basic function of the SQL backup. The next component we're going to take a look at is the archive server settings. These settings serve to connect the SQL Server and Enterprise PDM Archive Server Hive. To get to these settings, we want to go to the Archive Server Configuration tool. Whenever this launches, you can see over on the left side, you can browse to the different archives that this computer is connected to. In this case, we want to grab our development vault. Let's go ahead and take a look at the properties. You can see that there's the vault name, database name, and the server that it's connected to. If I select the Login tab, I can see the login type that's designated, but more importantly, we can see that it's using the default SQL login. Going to Tools, Backup Settings, I'm going to select what vaults to back up the settings for, the location where I want these the backup settings to reside. I can also set a schedule for this particular backup. In this case, we'll go ahead and leave it to default for every week on Saturday. And then notice down at the bottom there's a password section. Because this has the SQL Server settings and password embedded, you typically want to password protect this because the account that is being used has DB owner access. The next section to take a look at is the Enterprise PDM Server, or PDM Archive Server. This is where the actual files are stored, and it's very critical that this gets backed up. During the installation, it's designated where these files are stored, but if you're unsure, you can always check the registry to double check where the archive server resides. So let's go ahead and take a look at the registry. Launching the registry editor, I can go up to the HKey local machine hive of my registry, into the software section, and then select SOLIDWORKS. From there I go to Applications, PDMWorks Enterprise, Archive Server, and then in the vault section you can see all the vaults on my computer, and then go to the archive table. The list of folders in this section is what is referred to as the Archive Server Hive. This particular location houses all the files. Generally speaking, you never want to get into this section unless you have some sort of particular technical support reason, but let's go and take a look at what's in this folder. Now remember that the actual folder we want to back up is a top level folder, so you never want to back up just a single segment of this. If I go in and take a look at this particular folder, you can see a couple of compressed file versions, thumbnail images, a native SOLIDWORKS file, and then the index file that correlates this file location to the SQL Server tables. So in a few minutes we'll take a look at adding this to a particular backup scheme on this computer. Remember that if you're in a replicated environment, you want to make sure that the archives table on the remote servers also get included in the backup loop. Failure to do this can result in the vaults becoming really unsynchronized. So you want to make sure that the backups are as close to each other as possible in time. Let's go ahead and take a look at the cold storage location as designated in the cold storage schema within our Vault admin. So this setting requires us to get into the Enterprise PDM Vault Administration application. Once we log into our vault, we'll go ahead and provide our credentials, and we'll scroll down on the left side and you can see cold storage schemas. You can select a new cold storage schema, or let's go and take a look at one that I've already created. So I've given this a name, and then I've pointed it to a particular archive server. In this case, it's going to be my local computer. In a replicated environment, you'll see the servers listed as well. I can choose to delete the archive files or move them to a particular folder so they can be retrieved later on. Note that you can encode this with a particular year, month, and day. So for example, I can choose a 2-year digit, 2-year month, and so on. The media name or the file name can also be encoded with a counter value. Depending on how frequently your cold storage schema is scheduled to run, you may want to increase or decrease the counter value. I can designate what folders are included, the number of versions to keep, and then also tell to never move versions with a revision, so that way formal revisions get retained in the vault. So that file location is something that also needs to be included in our backup scheme. The final element are the local vault views on the local computers. Generally speaking, you don't really need to include this in a backup. It is an optional backup, but if you do elect to do it, be sure that you include all the hidden files in these folders because they're very specific to each vault view. Files like the desktop INI files typically are passed over or not included, but those are what encode the files and what Enterprise uses to designate what computer each file is checked on, what each file is checked out on, what computer it is. So let's take a look at a way to backup. Now I'm using Windows 8 in this particular CADcast. Windows 8 has a file or a backup utility, but the one that is probably most useful for this activity is the legacy support for the Windows 7 file recovery. In this particular instance, I've already created a backup scheme. So I go down to my change settings, and like any other backup software, you can designate what folders to include in the schedule and so on. On a server level, this interface is going to probably look significantly different, but I just wanted to include a quick example of a backup scheme. So if I look through this, I can tell what folders on my computer I want to include from a backup. So for example, scrolling down to the SQL Server, you can see that I've got my server instance in the backup folder. So that's going to grab all my database backups. Going down to Enterprise, Data, Development, that'll grab my archive server Hive. Scrolling down a little bit further, I want to go ahead and grab the temp directory because that's where I told my archive server settings to be backed up, and then also include my cold storage location. So at this point, this particular system is set up to back up everything that is included in my Enterprise PDM vault. Let's take a look at what's actually in this folder just to validate, and you can see that I've got some backup data, cold storage. If I go into the cold storage folder, you can see the encoded file names or folder names for the cold storage backup, and then there's the actual backup folder itself. So a couple of quick tips. The archive server file compression is not enabled by default. It does require that gzfilter be included as part of your install. The cold storage schemas are definitely optional and are really more useful for large vaults. So let's take a look at how to enable the file compression utility. So on the server, and this is going to require you to do it on the actual Enterprise server, we go into the local settings, group policy, and then this brings up the group policy editor. If I go to my administrative templates, expand that, and then go down to right click, edit, remove templates, you can see that I already have the PDM Works Enterprise add-in enabled. If I select add, the default location for this particular admin tool is within the installation media, support, and then policies, and you can see got a file called pdmworks.adm. So whenever that's enabled, if I go down to classic administrative templates, expand that, you'll see an entry for SOLIDWORKS Enterprise PDM, and then one for my archive server. The archive server compression utility, if I right click on it and edit it, you can see that I can enable it, disable it, or not configured. I can give it a schedule, and then on the right pane you can see that the syntax for the scheduling is included. What this will do is take all the different versions as you edit files and compress them to save file space. The next thing to show you is some tips in the SQL Server maintenance. So it's advisable to rebuild the index, but sometimes you don't necessarily know, or if you find that the performance is slow, you can always go back into the SQL Management Studio, create a new query, and then we'll use the T-SQL dbcc space show config, and then we want to select a particular database to run this statement on, or this query on, and go ahead and execute. And you can see that within the results come back, and it gives me a lot of information about fragmentation on this database. So for example, my history variables table has some fragmentation, probably due to just different setup activity and that type of stuff. So this is more informational if you want to go through and do some diagnostics on your server. Another useful query is the ability to find out how big our transaction logs are. So if I create a query for dbcc space SQL PERF and then log space in parentheses, you'll see the transaction logs for each particular database on my system. So for example, my development log is about 0.99 megs, and it's using 33% of the space allocated. The transaction logs should not be limited, because during updates they can cause failures in your service pack updates. So you want to let those things grow, but use a backup schedule to keep them in line, or keep them in size. Thanks for watching this DDI CADcast for SOLIDWORKS Enterprise PDM Backup and Maintenance. Please visit us at www.ddicad.com.